Welcome, everyone. Доброго вечора. Bonjour. Tansi. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you for this special event of the Indigenous Ukrainian Relationship Initiative. My name is Larissa Hajduk. I am the director of the Ukrainian Resource and Development Center at Maclean University. I am here with the members of the initiative, Mirna Kostash, Naomi McGrath, and Marina Chernявska. Today, we are in for a special treat, a conversation with Niigaan Sinclair. And the title tells it all. Ukrainian people are my people too, an indigenous perspective on relationality, war, and reconciliation. After a short intro, Professor Sinclair will deliver a presentation, followed by Q&A. So if you have a question, kindly write it in the Q&A section of the webinar. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for your interest. And now I am turning over to Naomi to offer land acknowledgement.
That's it, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So, Naomi Nitsikasun. My name is Naomi. I'm a Métis person from Edmonton, and I've just been thinking a lot about truth recently and truth and reconciliation. I'm not a fluent speaker of Cree, of Plains Cree, but I can share a little bit that I know. So in Plains Cree, if I were to speak the truth, I'd say tapwe, but if I wanted to just talk about truth as a noun, I would say tapwe win, tapwe win. And we don't really have a word for reconciliation, but there is a word that kind of suggests reconciliation. It's more like setting things right. So we say kwayas kwastike win. So tapwe win, truth, and kwayas kwastike win. So I put together this land acknowledgement for this very special evening, and I call this Truth Before Reconciliation, because we kind of have to do that before we do the second part. So the truth is that there's another genocide happening in Ukraine, yet again. Add to this at least 6 other areas on Earth where genocides are happening. The truth is that the genocide happening here in North America has never really stopped. Just ask a residential school survivor and their family, or the family of a missing or murdered Indigenous woman or relative, or an Indigenous woman who was forcibly sterilized here in Canada. The truth is that this forum is happening on Indigenous land here in Edmonton, where we are gathered, and there in Wînipêk, where you and yours are gathered, Dr. Niigaan, Dr. Sinclair, and there where all of you have gathered are joining. The truth is that our churches and our governments worked hard to cover up these sinister parts of our history and what has happened to Indigenous peoples. The truth is that churches and governments have worked hard to separate Indigenous peoples and settlers. The truth is that Indigenous peoples have been here since pretty much forever. The truth is that some settlers' families have been here since half of forever. The truth is that settlers benefit from what has been taken from Indigenous peoples: land, children, self-governance, spirituality, riches, resources, self-determination. The truth is that I, and lots of us, are both Indigenous and settler. And that really complicates things in a delicious and delirious way. I couldn't help myself on that one. The truth is that we must unleash the truth before we can embark on reconciliation. I believe that the truth is that reconciliation is possible. So what will you do about truth and reconciliation? So that's my land acknowledgement. I have different kinds, and as a Métis person, I work in the area of Indigenous relations. I work for the city of Edmonton on an Indigenous framework, and I've learned that Indigenous people generally don't do land acknowledgements, but it's always my honor when I'm asked to do. I'm humbled and honored at the same time, that because my non-Indigenous side, to offer the land acknowledgement. So I just wanted to also say how much I appreciate my other three sisters, Myrna and Larissa and Marina, who have welcomed me into this circle. So there you go. Hi.
Hi, Daku. Thank you, Naomi, for this powerful land acknowledgement. I would like to share a few words about our initiative. We have a lot of people here today who are here for the first time. And Indigenous Ukrainian Relationship Initiative started 6 years ago in 2020 as a collaboration between the Ukrainian Resource and Development Center at Maclean University and the Cool Center for Ukrainian and Canadian Folklore at the University of Alberta. Our main goal is to explore, learn, share, and reflect on our history here in this country, and also on our shared Indigenous Ukrainian pasts, in order to build a better future for the well-being of all. The working group and the driving force of this initiative are the four women you see on your screens: Merna Kostas, Naomi McElrath, Larissa Hajduk, and me. It is my great honor and pleasure to be working with them. I would also like to acknowledge Leah Hrisun and Chelsea Vowell, who were active part of this initiative in the first few years. Thanks to Leah, we have the name of our website, Stories of These Lands. I would also like to acknowledge Métis Cree artist Sharon Rose Kutney, who created our beautiful logo. If you're new to this space, we encourage you to explore our website, storiesoftheselands.ca, where you can learn about us, about our work, and also have access to recordings of almost all of our past events. And with this, I would like to turn it over to Myrna Kostas.
Here we go. Greetings, everyone. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce into our conversation this evening this Dr. Niigaan Sinclair, who has joined us. Now, Dr. Sinclair is an Anishinaabe from Peguis First Nation in Manitoba. He's an award-winning writer, editor, professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. And many of you may already know him as named in 2022 by Maclean's magazine, one of the most influential people in Canada. That was only 2 years ago. What's he been doing since? Wow. So Niigaan is a multiple nominee of Canadian Columnist of the Year, and he won that award in 2018. And his commentary appears weekly on multiple platforms across Canada, from the pages of the Wînipêk Free Press to TV shows on CBC. He's a featured member of the Friday Power panel on CBC's Power and Politics. A lot of people have seen you there, Niigaan. He's a featured member, I've said that, and he's also a news commentator on the Aboriginal People's Television Network. And just this afternoon, I came across his series of talks from 2024 that are up now on YouTube, Lunch and Learn with Niigaan Sinclair. And you can see from his very animated presentation that he is a former secondary school teacher who won the 2019 Peace Educator of the Year from the Peace and Justice Studies Association based at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. His first book, Wînipêk, Visions of Canada from the Indigenous Centre, which was published in 2024, was a national bestseller that won the 2024 Governor General's Award for Nonfiction. But here's a fun fact. Niigaan's research includes, among much else, graphic novels. And this is a nice way to seg you into the other fun fact, which is how you, Niigaan, and I first met, also on Zoom, and when we both served as jurors for the literary prize called the Kobzar, which means troubadour in English from Ukrainian, sponsored by Winnipeg's own Shevchenko Foundation. And it honors the diverse stories that spotlight the Ukrainian-Canadian cultural legacy. So we jurors were charged with agreeing on a short list of 3 titles. And that's when I discovered that you had a lot of acute angles on the graphic novel under consideration, Red Harvest, that ultimately did make our shortlist. So graphics in that book about a famine in Soviet Ukraine in the 1930s. Nice to see you again, Niigaan, and now over to you. Ukrainian people are my people too, an Indigenous perspective on relationality, war, and reconciliation.
Okay. So Niigaan, thanks so much, Myrna. Everyone can hear me okay? Yep. Okay. I apologize if there's music in the background. Can you hear the music in the background? Okay, that's wonderful because it's very rocky. I just pulled over because I didn't want to make you guys wait anymore. I pulled over at a coffee shop here that I frequently go to, so I know this place very well, and it's nice to be here. My name is Niigaan Sinclair. So bonjour de Magraduk, Niigaan Wevedam de Cost, Namagoshin de Lemdiman, and Namomayan. Bonjour de Mishomasak, Komasak, Nijana Gijan Gaman, Navici Nibakwe. It's nice to be with you here from Treaty 1 territory. So I'm in Wînipêk, Manitoba. I'm not in most of you are in Edmonton, is that right? Is that right? Yep. Okay. Thank you for nodding because I only get a few faces on the screen here, so I can't see everybody. And so I was just in Edmonton just a couple weeks ago at the Greater Edmonton Teachers Association training, and you know, I have lots of family in Edmonton, so I have a connection through the school system there as well. And my auntie was a school teacher in Edmonton. And I'm also very close with Richard Van Camp and Kiwi Martin, who, of course, if you know anything about Edmonton, they have taken Edmonton by storm, the two of them. And Kiwi's a musician and former professor. And Richard, of course, is a great writer, Sleecho writer who lives there. And I always pass through Edmonton on my way to Yellowknife, which I go to pretty frequently. So it's nice to be here. It's nice to share with you a little bit of the story of what I have been sharing over the past, certainly past few years, talking a little bit about the history of where I come from. We are going on very tragically 4 years of this terrible conflict, which is certainly not something that Ukraine willingly participated in, but were forced into by their neighbors to the east and the west, sorry. And so we're in this kind of 4th year of this position in which I think all of us have been watching with horror, with a great deal of concern, and particularly with a great deal of anger in that there is a kind of a ongoing trend from our relatives to the south of demonizing, misrepresenting, and certainly picking a side in this conflict that has been nothing more you could really describe other than just shameful in the different ways in which money, individualism, capitalism, and what has been a long-standing underneath culture in the United States, which has always been about it's always been about money and power. And now certainly we can see what selfishness looks like when you allow selfishness to go unchecked. Then what you do is you get the situation in which we see now. And it was never supposed to be that way. Like, it was never supposed to be the way in which we see selfishness, individuality, and capitalism as part of these ways of life in this place. When settlers showed up here in Manitoba, where I'm sitting right now, we are the coldest climate other than the north in this country. We are a place in which it's frequently minus 30, 40, 50 degrees. We are a place in which it is very, very difficult to live. It is not easy to be able to find enough food and medicine to be able to provide and support for yourself. And that has always been the struggle of this place. It has never been about colonialism, racism, and the Indian Act and racist policies and practices. The hardest struggle of this place has always been the winter. And Indigenous peoples have always known that. We have known that the biggest struggle has been in sticking together during the hard times, making sure that you share when you feel the hungriest, making sure that you take care of the person beside you when you feel the weakest. That is what the teaching of this place where I come from is about. And so it's no surprise that people who come from an equally cold, very desolate, difficult place to live, Ukraine, end up here in Manitoba. There was a wonderful study that was done in 2011, and it was by a woman named Mariana Hermick, and she documented the history of the relationship between Ukrainians and Indigenous peoples in Manitoba. And what she did is she studied it in several different ways: the political geography, the cultural geography, and then, of course, the historical ways in which communities came together. And one of those communities that she studied was my community in the town of Selkirk, Manitoba, which is on the Red River. We are the birth of the Métis people. The Red River Métis people come from my community. We are the signing of Treaty 1, which is literally a rock's throw from where I grew up on Beresford Avenue in Selkirk, Manitoba. You could literally walk over to Lower Fort Garry to see the original site of where the original fur trading area in which Treaty 1 was signed between settlers and Indigenous peoples to share the land. And then, of course, I come from the place in which the very first treaty in 1817 between Lord Selkirk, what the town was named after, Selkirk, and Chief Peguis, the chief on the Red River, of five different communities, came together to commit to an allowance for non-Indigenous peoples to live in Manitoba for the very first time, or with this territory that I'm now living in, which is known as Wînipêk. Wînipêk is the term that we use for the watershed, which where I am sitting right now is the bottom. Anyways, my point of it is that in every scenario that was brought along those paths, and particularly that first moment of treaty back in 1817, we said to the newcomers that you will never survive if you are selfish, if you are individualistic. And yet the British, when they arrived here, were extremely xenophobic. They brought with positions and ideas that were very divisive. They said, we're never going to marry into your communities. We're not going to allow trade to take place outside of these forts, and you will only work at a price of our declaration. Very much the same kind of attitude that most Europeans brought to this territory, to these lands that we now know as North America. And those early British, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch settlers that came to this place brought things like the doctrine of discovery. They brought things like terra nullius. They brought things like, simply by us putting our foot on the land, we are more civilized. We have governance systems. We have writing systems. In fact, Indigenous peoples had all of those things. And yet none of those things were recognized. And my point of it is to redocument that history would be to very much teach you the history of ore. But we as Indigenous peoples always said to newcomers, come in our lodges, share our food, and most importantly is learn from us, learn about all the things that we need to know about this place. And that was the epitome of my community, where I come from. Where I come from in Selkirk, Manitoba, there were deep, deep relationships with Indigenous peoples and the newcomers, mostly Anishinaabe, Cree, and British, French, German people. And as we began to learn from each other and engage one another, we began to birth out the Métis Nation. That's where the Métis Nation comes from. They come from that point of commitment, which is that Indigenous peoples taught those newcomers that the only way we will survive the winter, the only way we will embody our future, is if we commit to each other. And then our children, what are they? They are not Indigenous, they are not settlers, they are both. And that is what treaty is supposed to be about. There was never supposed to be Indigenous and settler. There was never supposed to be that. But there is it because of racist practice and policy in the country. And my point of it is that if we continue to look at the history of certain pockets of places within Canada in which people came together, worked together, lived together, had children together, we start to see an amazing possibility. And one of those possibilities is in my history growing up in the 1980s in Selkirk, Manitoba, in which Ukrainians, people who had left, had been disenfranchised, had left their homelands many, many moons ago to bring their lessons, their teachings, their families, their food, their culture to this place. You start to see all those things I saw growing up. You know, my birthday is January 7th. And for anyone who, is Ukrainian, you know what that means. You know that Ukrainian Christmas is on January 7th. And when I was growing up, everyone around me, all my best friends, were Ukrainians. And so one of those families was the Kowalczyk family. Harry and Barb Kowalczyk were the parents, and they had three sons. One of them was Kelly, and then there was Barry, and then there's Rob. And Kelly, who is the youngest, was my best friend. And he and I played hockey together. He and I spent every noon hour together, every recess, every party at high school together. We spent every single day together then, and we still spend that time together now. We are still best friends, and we are now 50 years old. Lifelong. We don't think the same way. We don't act the same way. We don't vote the same way. But we are forever brothers. And that starts in high school. It starts with the kind of principle that surrounding me were Ukrainians that had learned a number of things that I recognized. And here's was the following things. When I grew up in ceremony. I grew up surrounded by Indigenous peoples who shared, who danced together, who worked together, and feasted together, who shared ceremony and language together, and people who would commit to each other during periods of the year, particularly during harvest time or solstice time, in which they would stay together for long periods of time, usually 3 or 4 days. And the reason I'm telling you all of that is because this is exactly what I learned in the Kowalczyk household. When I spent time with all of those, for instance, in the trying to remember Rusalka, with the Rusalka dancers, Mrs. Kowalczyk was in charge of the Ukrainian dance troupe in our area. Sorry, the Troyanda dance troupe in our area of Selkirk. These would be festivals that would take place in dance, in which people would commit to time of happiness and love and learning from each other. It wasn't just about food, although that's oftentimes, I think, was the best part of spending time with Ukrainian families and communities. But it was also about spending time in ceremony, which would be about song and dance and commitment and family and nation. And when I would spend time, I would also start to realize that many of the things that I saw growing up, and these are things that Myrna talks about, Mariana speaks about in her study. What she speaks about is that in many cases, there's the following things that Ukrainians and Indigenous peoples, by living so closely together, started to mesh their cultures. And the ways in which they meshed their cultures were in what's often referred to as the headscarves or the babushka scarves that are now used by grandmothers in particular, but they're often used by powwow dancers in ceremony, through trade and through the kind of spectacle of the colors that we learned from many Ukrainians. Another thing that we learned was that in the dances that we would share together, many of the what's called men's fancy powwow dancers adopt almost completely, I would almost call plagiarize, the dances that are used in Ukrainian traditional men's dancing. And if you go to powwows, you can still see today, now decades later, all of those moves which have been picked up by many of our relatives by living and working and marrying into Ukrainian families. It doesn't just go into clothing, though, and culture. It actually goes into ethic. And one of those things that I really learned growing up was the ethic of work and the ethic of collaboration and community. When I would witness Harry Kowalczyk, Mr. Kowalczyk, my best friend's father, he ran a business, and it was a lumber business, and it was in the north end of Wînipêk, which was this very dynamic area, but predominantly Indigenous area. Harry had relationships with many Indigenous peoples, business owners, but also people who looked on reserves up north. And if you read Mariana's study, she talks about Indigenous farmers and Ukrainian farmers working together to overcome drought and blight, and to overcome the huge preponderance of racism and attitudes from those who believe that cultures and communities that were not their own, such as many who come from British and French and German communities, who thought that other cultures and communities were lazy and tired and or always out to make a quick buck or whatever it might have been. That you saw Ukrainians and Indigenous peoples, by both experiencing that racism together, coming together to share farming tasks, to share the building of cultures and communities. And most importantly, when families work together, then their children begin to marry and their children begin to create families. And that is the vision of treaty. And if you were to ask me and say, who was one of the best treaty people you ever saw growing up? Who were the people, who was a person that you remember who shared, who cared for his neighbor, who cared and made sure that he gave more than he ever received in return? A person who committed to a community in which Indigenous peoples were of a significant majority population, but then never acted better than, never acted differently from. In fact, did everything he could to build that community, volunteer, to give out all those things that are necessary to build healthy communities. It was Harry Kowalczyk. It was Mr. Kowalczyk. Mr. Kowalczyk, who just passed away tragically just a few years ago due to old age generally, but his heart gave out. It was Mr. Kowalczyk who was a person who was truly a treaty person. And he was an Orthodox Ukrainian man who went to church, but absolutely was beloved in the Indigenous community. And what I mean by that is, at his funeral, if you looked at all of the different young men who he had helped to raise, who him and Barb Kowalczyk had raised, who they had had over for dinner, who they had had over to help, shovel the snow or build, drive them to hockey or to care for them or to work in the store. Who was it that raised a group of young Indigenous men in particular to be healthy, strong individuals like the person sitting right in front of you? You would have seen at his funeral dozens of Indigenous men, dozens of people in which were saved in many ways by being a part of the Kowalczyk family. And I really believe that was not because of any magical reason. It was not because of any, mystical sort of stereotype. It's because the culture of Ukraine, or the culture of Ukrainian people very much resembles, connects, and speaks very comfortably and effectively to Cree and Anishinaabe people along the Red River. Where I come from, there's no surprise that people who understand the winter on one side of the world and people who understand winter on the other side of the world, and they understand that the only way that we can overcome the winter is through sharing, commitment, and what we might call treaty, or what we might just call kindness, generosity, all the things that are necessary for a family to be sitting around and welcome in those newcomers, no matter where they come from. That those two communities then join together where I come from. And very much when Russia exerted force and invaded Ukraine, that's my people too. Those are my people, because my people know more, as much, if not more than, what invasion, dispossession, what watching your relatives die in front of you, and being very much put in a position of having much of the world not understand the experience that you are experiencing. As an Indigenous person, we constantly and continually have experienced racism, dispossession, genocide in our own territories. And it is no surprise that from the winter to now, that we as Ukrainian people, as Indigenous people, joined together to ally to fight this tremendously violent genocidal force that is very much seeking to remove, to take, and most importantly, to divide. And this is the time in which we have to double down on each other. We have to do exactly what our ancestors did, which is that we have to turn to each other, just like we do during the winter, and say that we are there. We got each other's backs. We're here to share. We're here to commit to each other. And very much when I was asked to do this session this evening, I was like, when I'm sorry that I was late, but absolutely, I would do anything for my relatives, my Ukrainian relatives. I would do anything. When the dispossession first started, I've been walking with a group of people called the Mama Bear Clan in downtown Wînipêk, which is a frontline organization run by Indigenous women, mostly grandmothers. And what we do is we go out to the community and we offer water, we offer a sandwich, we offer care and resources. And most importantly, we tell people that we love them, because that's the thing that will solve colonialism. It will never be police. It will never be the division that we are often taught to think of each other as separate. What the most important thing we can ever do is turn to the person who is beside you and to say, you matter. I'm here for you. I'll be here for you. I will share my sandwich with you. I will share my resources with you. I'll share my space and my time with you. And that means that we're in this together. And in the north end of Wînipêk, we saw the largest influx of people who were escaping harm from Ukraine. And we, as a committee, as a group of people who are invested in the future of our neighborhood, we didn't just commit to supporting Indigenous peoples, is what we've been doing now for 7 years on that walk, but we began to focus and target new Ukrainian arrivals to make sure that they would have enough water, they had enough food, they had enough resources, but they also had toys for their children, that they had clothing, that we made sure that they felt safe and that they felt loved, and that we would join together and we would say to them, you're home here. Whether you're here for a few months or whether you're here forever, you are now a treaty person. You are part of this place, and you are our brother and sister too. And we don't always have to like each other. We don't always have to learn everything about each other, but we're in this together because that's the way we survive the winter. And that's what I wanted to say for tonight. I hope that was helpful to everybody. I hope that you turn out and you read some of that study that I posted. So if you look in your chat, I posted the article that I wrote back in 2022. And in that article, there is the quoting of that study at the University of Manitoba, which I hope that you get a chance to read, which it's free online. And you could read all about the ways in which the long history of connection between Ukrainians and Manitobans. It means a lot to Manitobans, and it means a lot to everybody that I speak to, that this conflict be ended, that Russia stop its aggression, and most importantly, that peace be brought to people who have never asked for this conflict and simply want to continue their autonomous nationhood, and we are there for you. You know, that is exactly what I just described to you, is exactly what Indigenous people seek as well. And so I hope that we join together and fight not only over there, but that we fight together here as well, because we are better off together than we ever are apart. So, Miigwech, thank you very much, everybody.
Well, Niigaan, that's very moving. And I wish a lot more of third, fourth, fifth generation Ukrainian Canadians would hear these words as well. And I hope that we'll make an effort to really circulate this because it's been recorded. But you know, speaking of the war specifically now, which is, I just saw the 1,483rd day of that war since you wrote your column. And you've spoken very movingly about how the newcomers have fit into your vision of being treaty people as well. And I wasn't aware. Maybe that's true, particularly of Wînipêk. I'm not sure that we would say the same in Edmonton, but that's not up to me. But here's the question I have arising from all of that. And that is the question of land. Because the newcomers do not have a history on the land. And I'm wondering, given the centrality of land and your relationship to it as an Indigenous person, and through and with the Métis people as well, how do you figure in the newcomer into your sense of family and treaty relationship without that settlement on the land, as it were, shared settlement on the land?
Well, the first is that we have to realize that the idea of ownership is an imported belief. We don't think of ourselves as owning the land, but we certainly do use that term now. And that's for a strategic purpose, because the idea of ownership has been imposed so brutally on people who don't see themselves as owning the land. In fact, if anything, we see as land owning us. And we have a relationship with land. We don't own it. Like, how do you own your cousin? How do you own your auntie? How would you own your grandmother? It would be absurd, right? And so we see ourselves as kin with the earth, and that means that we have responsibilities. We have to chop the wood. We have to shovel the snow. We have to do the dishes. You know, that's just like you would with any relative. And part of that is we have to work very, very hard to maintain the integrity of kindness, maintain the integrity of generosity, maintain the integrity of humanity in relation to all things, which is to be very humble. And that's not just about being humble with the trees or with the sun or the moon or the directions. It's also being humble with those who we share our territory with. And most importantly, it is to understand that there's no bad people, but some people learn bad things. And I think that one of the biggest, brutal, terrible, most destructive ideas is, often referred to as settler colonialism, but I'll just use the term of bad relationships, meaning that there is the kind of hierarchical belief of ownership, individuality, and capitalism that then divides us so deeply along money and power. And our job is to reject that as a central principle. And part of that rejection is, always ostracizing newcomers, right? And I think that for many Indigenous peoples, it's important to remind people that there is a newcomer Indigenous system that we have inherited, but it's also important to remind both ourselves as Indigenous peoples, but also the newcomers, that it was never supposed to be this way. It was never supposed to be this way. The way that it was supposed to be was that our children were supposed to marry. And that meant that everybody belongs here. Everybody is a treaty person, or everybody is a person who gets to share in the responsibility of maintaining this place, of working with the trees and the birds and the bears. But unfortunately, Many people think that there's only one way to do life, or there's only one way to be civilized, or there's only one way to run government. And as a result, we have these forces that are always undermining a sense of collectivity, kinship, and a sense of humanity. And so, do we still need to use those language to refer to settlers and people who are newcomers in these places, or referring to an us and them mentality? Well, I guess sometimes, but I'm not interested in that as a long-term solution. I'm interested in that, in thinking about it in terms of, it gets us to a place in which we understand that we have lots of work to do. We have power systems in play that will continue to undermine and divide us, but we're better than that. We really are. And part of being better than that is turning to the person beside you and say that we both belong here. And now what does that mean? What I often teach my students, and I teach this to my daughter as well, is whenever you speak to another person in your neighborhood, in your community, in your anything that involves a place that you love, remember that you are going to be together tomorrow. And if that's the ethic that we use in how we treat one another, then we would be truly living by an Indigenous ethic. An Indigenous ethic is never about ostracization and removal and eradication. An Indigenous ethic is based in life begats more life. So when I give life, or I promote life, or encourage life, I do what very much the bears are doing. I do what the birds are doing. I do what the river is doing, which is that I'm always making more life. And that means that we're all going to be in this thing together tomorrow living. And so we have to be mindful with our language. We have to be mindful with our treatment of each other. And most importantly, we can hold each other to account. But we have to remember that we're going to see each other right after that. And that means we have to, as my father always said, give each other inches. Give each other places to move. As you know, it's sometimes better to teach with a joke, with a bit of truth that is generous, with some kindness, than it is to shame, to cancel, to remove. Because none of those things really produce anything other than a whole lot of fear and division and separatism.
Thank you so much, Niigaan. I love this, making more life. Isn't that beautiful? It is beautiful. Could you please reflect on how your understanding of Indigenous Ukrainian relations evolve over years, since when you were a boy, young man, and do you see any changes? And what are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking at some of the questions in the chat, and so I'll try to address some of those things too. Certainly, I don't consider myself an expert on really anything for that matter. I'm a guy with opinions, and so what I would say that nobody is an expert on anything really. They just have some experience that they share, and my father would be the first to say that he didn't really know anything, but he was willing to talk about anything. I'll say this, I think there is an ongoing interdependency that is very specific to two groups in Wînipêk. And then there's these other groups which I think sometimes for one reason or another have been taught that they are separate to Indigenous groups, or maybe they're insular, or maybe they are discouraged to integrate with Indigenous peoples. But there's two groups in particular that are simply too intertwined with Indigenous peoples. So intertwined, in fact, that you almost can't see a difference between them geographically, culturally, socially. And I think one of those groups is Ukrainians. I think one of those groups is the Ukrainian people, who have integrated so deeply with Indigenous peoples that it's very hard to tell them apart in certain neighborhoods. And one of those neighborhoods is North Point Douglas. And the other group is, I would say, the French people. French people, because the unique relationship between French people and Anishinaabe and Cree people, the Métis people, oftentimes you can't tell the difference, or people who say it's French culture in the city, it's actually Indigenous culture. And so, like, for instance, the Voyageurs or the Festival de Voyageurs in town, very much the relationship between Ukrainians and Indigenous peoples in the North Point Douglas community are so intertwined. Not only ancestrally are people connected, but also literally living beside one another, literally raising children together, literally connected with culture and tradition. And I mentioned some of those things. I talked about the scarves. I talked about the dances. I talked about the ways in which Ukrainians, when they arrived in Manitoba, almost all of them moved to North Point Douglas, the inner city. Financially, that's the best thing probably for people who are newcomers. But it also means that you come in direct contact with Indigenous communities. And that means the relationship has changed very significantly, of course. But I actually don't think, I think it's gotten closer. I don't think it's gotten farther. I wouldn't say that about other cultural groups from certain communities of the world who have come to this place that I'm in. Many of them keep very far away from Indigenous communities. There's one community in particular who has adopted many Indigenous children, but yet still really keep those children in their own culture as opposed to integrating with Indigenous peoples in Indigenous cultural contexts. That's a bit of a broad statement, but I feel pretty secure on it, knowing what I do about the demographics of the city of Wînipêk.
Thank you, Niigaan. I have a question about young people, and it addresses your personal experience. It's a question to you as a teacher, as a mentor, as a professor at the University of Manitoba. What does it mean to you to teach about relationality and reconciliation? Do you have any Ukrainians in your classroom? Do you have any newcomers who fled Ukraine after the start of the full-scale war with Russia? How do you approach teaching them, and what are you learning from them? How do you get Indigenous and settler students to stay in the room together?
Well, so I would say that the most amount of students that I have are Indigenous students. And after the first year, so from second year all the way to fourth year, and graduate students, master's, PhD, the majority are by far Indigenous students. And but frankly, most of the non-Indigenous students in my program, or many of the Indigenous students in the program, have deep connections with two groups of people. Icelandic people, which are very intricately tied in one community here in Manitoba called Gimli. And so many Icelandic people are very deeply connected. And so you'll find many Indigenous peoples that carry Icelandic names like Borkfjord or Gustafsson or, very much Icelandic names. But the second group is you'll find many Ukrainian Indigenous peoples who end up in my classes. So enough that I've noticed it. And that means that one or two in a group of 20, let's say, right? So enough that I've noticed it. Now, in my first year class, we have the Indigenous credit requirement, and that means that they're required to take 3 credit hours in Indigenous Studies in order to do any degree in arts, and that's 17 different departments: psychology, criminology, political science, all those kinds of ones, psychology, but also Indigenous Studies, women's studies, labor studies, those kinds of things. And so I haven't quite noticed, if I were to go through the names, I suppose I would probably notice Ukrainian students, but most of those classes are filled with newcomers, meaning brand new people who have coming to the university for the very first time, coming to Manitoba for the very first time. And so I would probably say that there's Ukrainians in there, I'm sure, but I don't really note anything other than just a whole lot of people from all across the world. In the 150 or so students that I teach, I would say easily a third of them are from other countries. And then I would say another third are Canadians who come from different cultural backgrounds. And then there's a third, which are Indigenous peoples who are taking Indigenous Studies as a major or coming into the upper years courses. I will just say what I teach that class, which is what I teach that class is that I'm not here to teach you Indigenous Studies. I'm actually here to teach you how to be Canadian. Because in this class, We learn the foundational principles of what it means to be Kanatian, because the word Kanata is an Iroquoian word, an indigenous word, which means the village. And so that means that what you're going to learn in this class is you're going to learn about how indigenous values, principles, ideas built everything that we know of in the here. Like democracy, healthcare, multiculturalism, free speech, these are indigenous ideas. Europeans did not bring these ideas. The Europeans actually learned these ideas when they got here. If we had gone by European ideas, predominantly British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, Dutch, we would be living in a system of very much the 1%. It would be thoroughly based in patriarchy. It would be based in a whole lot of racism. In fact, we can probably see that there's been a tension here for a long time. Indigenous values, multiculturalism, democracy, healthcare, free speech, and then the racism, division, capitalism, individuality, and the idea that the only people who matter are the Pope and the King. And we're like, no, everybody in the circle matters. And so that's been at tension now for 150 years. And so what I say to people in my classes is that you tell me what's going to help us survive the winter. Is it going to be turning away from each other and being selfish and being based in division and thinking one group of people are better than another group of people? Or is it going to be us committing to each other? Is it going to be about us sharing? Is it going to be about us building the lodge together? You tell me what's going to help us survive the winter. I'm going to bet on the second one, not the first one. And so I teach them that. Everything in my class is about that. In that everything that we learn is that if we don't learn, engage from one another and double down on each other, we'll never build an economy. We'll never save the environment. We'll continue to be mired into fights over race, fights over power, fights over money and individuality. And then ultimately, we're going to build a country that's based in selfishness. And it's going to look very much like an orange beast who runs the government according to his own ego and his own personal vested selfishness.
They're lucky to have you as a teacher. And I wish that such a course would be a requirement for every degree in every Canadian university. Thank you, Niigaan.
Do we have time for my question? Yep, okay. So Dr. Niigaan, thank you very much for everything that you shared tonight. I'm a Métis person. I have a kind of a complicated history. My dad's non-Indigenous, but he was raised at Frog Lake for 10 years as a child, and I'm Indigenous on my mom's side. And because of our history, we're disconnected from our roots there. So much of what you said today is how I was raised, and I really appreciate that. But my question for you is, we have a situation here in Alberta. I'm sure you're aware of it. So here we have a group of First Nations chiefs in Alberta who are calling for politicians to show greater respect for treaty rights in the wake of recent events that have stirred up discussion of the province either separating from Canada or joining the United States. I read your essay, Manifesting More Than Elbows Up. I bought the book because I knew you were going to be talking, so I bought the book. And in that essay, you write that here's the good news. Canadians can learn a lot from neighbor Indigenous nations about how manifest destiny takes place, feels, and what happens afterwards. And I think a lot about the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny in the work that I do on the Indigenous framework. So my question for you is, what is that good news, and how will that good news play out in the future?
Well, it'll be first off by okay, the first thing is it's going to be inevitable. This is not a choice. And I think I'll address also your friend's comment in the chat here about I live around a bunch of separatists and they say that Indigenous peoples are defeated or something like that. Okay. Like just friggin' like I always like think to myself, like, it's sometimes hard to be generous with people who don't want to learn history, like, or facts, or want to, they want to ignore truth. Like, I mean, because the fact is that we're all only here because of the generosity of Indigenous peoples, and the fact that Indigenous peoples invited the newcomers in and saved their butts when they showed up in October, because half of them would be dead by Christmas. And so the fact is that we can believe in the pioneering narrative all we want, but we have to realize that the only reason the pioneers survived one winter is because of the generosity of the people who were looking at them and going, yeah, well, we got a lodge here that we can help you with. When you freeze out and you forget, or you're not able to live through this minus 50-degree winter. My whole point is that we really just have to be generous with each other. And the reason I say this is inevitable is because if you look at a map and if you look at the population demographics, there was a study that was published today, which said that the Canadian population is shrinking for the very first time ever. Who is the one community who is not shrinking? In fact, who is the one community that's going up a third every generation, every 10 years? It's Indigenous young people. If you go up to Iqaluit, which I just was 2 weeks ago, you'll see that over 1/3 of that community is under the age of 25. That's Inuit people. And if you go to Wînipêk right here, over a quarter of all Indigenous peoples are under the age of 25. Like, you can just look at the school system, look at the population demographics. So right now today, we are 1 in 5 people in Manitoba are Indigenous. But by the year 2000, we'll say 2035, 10 years from now, it's going to be 1 in 4, and then 1 in 3. And the Canadian population is going to continue to shrink. The Indigenous population is going to increase. It already is happening. And so in communities like Wînipêk, Regina, Saskatoon, Edmonton, Calgary, Thunder Bay, those communities right there, those 6 communities, you've already seen huge population demographics, and working with Indigenous peoples is the most employable skill. It's more important than math. It's more important than science, because if you can't work effectively with Indigenous peoples, you can't do math and science, because you'll be too caught up in all the conflicts and the struggles. You will never get a pipeline, a mine, a highway, a building done until you can talk effectively with Indigenous peoples. And that means that I don't really care how much math you know or science. Like, you have to know how to work with people. That's how this country is going to move forward. And the really good news for everybody is, if we work effectively together, we're probably going to have air to breathe. We're probably going to have water to drink. We're probably going to have fresh food to eat. This is the key of understanding, is that when Indigenous peoples are part and at the table, that means that we think about the caribou, we think about the bears, we think about the air, we think about the water. That means it will be at the table. And for those who are worried about capitalists, pipelining the heck out of the world so that we can't breathe anymore, if Indigenous peoples are at the table and you care about breathing, I guarantee that won't happen. When Indigenous peoples are at the table, we'll make sure that our rights are intrinsically tied up with the fact that bears need to exist in order for us to sing songs about the bear. So that means that we're going to put our lives on the line to make sure that we can all have air to breathe, water to drink, food to eat. And so that's what I would say, is that it's not just inevitable, it's actually the best thing for us, is that if we stand together and Indigenous rights benefit everybody. I wouldn't say that always about human rights, because human rights are oftentimes forgetting that Indigenous rights, or leaving Indigenous rights behind. Human rights often ostracize or remove or say things like, oh, well, certain cultures matter and certain cultures don't, especially in the context of the way Canada has employed human rights. But Indigenous rights means that everybody's supposed to matter here. Everybody is supposed to be considered. Every single being is supposed to be respected. Not just humans, though, like the earth, like the sun, like the moon, like the sky, those kinds of things. I apologize, everybody. I have to go, because I said that I would be meeting someone at my house very shortly. And I wish I had done this at my house. So I apologize for being delayed. There was a school being named after my father. I don't know if you know who my father is. And so I was at a meeting with the committee that is naming the school after my father, and they just kept talking. Wonderful people, but I kept going. I got all these Ukrainians that want to talk to me. So I gotta go.
They allowed you to-
So now I'm in a Starbucks. As you can see here, I'm in a lovely Starbucks right here. And they're very generous and kind to let me do this presentation here. So
But thank you so much, Niigaan. Maybe next time. Maybe next time when you are in Edmonton, please do let us know. So on behalf, I'm going to wrap up and we will answer as many questions as we can if the questions that were to our initiative, and we will share the article that Niigaan mentioned. So you will receive an email. But on behalf of the Indigenous Ukrainian Relationship Initiative, on behalf of everyone present here, I extend our sincere gratitude to Niigaan for so generously sharing your thoughts, your knowledge, your experiences, and for opening your heart here. To everyone, thank you for being with us this evening. Thank you for your interest and engagement. Your presence helps us, the four of us, continue this important work. I invite you to visit our website, storiesofThislands.com, storiesofThislands.com, and stay connected.
It's .ca. Sorry, .ca.
Thank you, Marina. StoriesofThislands.ca. And more importantly, I encourage you to carry these conversations forward, to reflect deeply, to engage openly, to foster courageous dialogue in your own communities. Let us continue learning together, moving forward with intention. It is through reciprocity and relationships grounded in trust that we can truly learn to live well together. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Sinclair.
Diaku?
Дякую.
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 До побачення. До побачення.
Miigwech, everybody. Thank you so much. That's what we say. And here I even learned how to write it properly. There you go. So from me. So.
Thank
Thanks, everybody.
you, Dr. Niigaan.
Thank you.